When the house becomes too quiet, it starts pressing down on you, like a heavy blanket. I first realized this on that Saturday evening when Mum and her husband Jack left for New York for a couple of days. The entire house, a huge 2-story mansion with high ceilings and wide windows, was at my disposal. Well, almost at my disposal. Jack's son Alex was also here. Not that I knew Alex well. We met a few months ago when our parents got married, and although we live under the same roof, we remain almost strangers. Alex is a reserved guy who always hides behind his headphones or a book. He seems completely indifferent to the world around him, including me. And honestly, I'm not trying to change that. We say hello, exchange a few words at dinner, but that's about it. I spent the day in my usual rhythm, music turned up, experimenting in the kitchen, and long phone calls with friends. By evening, I decided to make pizza. The whole process, starting with kneading the dough, always calmed me. I was already rolling out the dough when I heard footsteps. Someone was coming down the stairs. It was Alex. He walked into the kitchen, bringing with him his usual aura of silent calm. He was wearing a simple grey t-shirt and jeans, but he looked like he'd just stepped off the page of some trendy magazine for young intellectuals. He stopped by the fridge, opened it, and froze for a moment as if he'd forgotten why he came. "Are you having dinner?" I asked, hoping he'd grab something and head back to his room. But he closed the fridge and instead sat on a high bar stool across from me. His gaze, usually indifferent, was different this time. It felt like he was studying me, thinking about something. "Do you always listen to music so loudly?" he asked, with a slight smile. "Only when the house is quiet," I replied, not looking up. I was too absorbed in smoothing the edge of the dough to pay him much attention. "Quiet? Do you mean when I'm not around?" His tone was joking, but I felt there was something more behind his words. "No," I finally looked at him. "Just when the parents aren't here, the house feels kind of empty." Alex nodded as if he understood. He sat silently for a few seconds, then added, "It seems like you try to avoid me." I froze. His words caught me off guard. I was going to respond, but instead I just stared at him. His gaze was direct and honest, and there was something in it that made my fingers involuntarily clench into fists. "I'm not avoiding you," I finally said. But even to my own ears it sounded unconvincing. "Really?" Alex leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then why do you always find an excuse to leave whenever we're in the same room?" His question threw me off. I wanted to say I just wasn't used to his presence, that we were as different as night and day, and that I hadn't thought about him more than necessary. But deep down, I knew that would be a lie. "That's nonsense," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'm just used to being on my own. It has nothing to do with you." "Sure," he said, but his smile grew a bit wider, as if he knew I wasn't telling the whole truth. I turned away, focusing back on the dough, but I could feel his gaze like a spotlight. The room was filled with a silence that pressed down, making me think about things I would rather ignore. When I finally looked at him, he was still there, looking at me just as intently. That look was nothing like the one I was used to. It was observant but not cold. Rather, there was something warm in it, foreign but not frightening. "The pizza will be ready soon," I said to break the awkwardness. Alex nodded and remained seated as if he had nowhere else to be. And that's when I realized this evening would definitely be different. That same evening when the pizza was ready, I thought I'd be able to avoid more conversations with Alex, but he seemed to have different plans. He took a slice, returned to the kitchen, and sat down at the table where I was already trying to hide behind my laptop screen, pretending to work. It was strange. In a huge house with so many rooms to escape to, he chose to stay here. "Do you always work this seriously during dinner?" he asked, taking a bite of pizza. "It's called multitasking," I replied without looking up. "Or avoidance," he countered with a slight smirk. I put my laptop aside. Ignoring him was becoming difficult. His tone wasn't hostile, just genuinely curious. He seemed calm, but his gaze was analyzing me, as if trying to solve a mystery. Aren't you tired of it? I squinted at him. These hints, questions, what are you trying to find out? Alex paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I want to understand why you keep your distance. You don't seem against me, yet you keep me at arm's length. Maybe you're keeping a distance too? I said, feeling strangely exposed. You're not exactly the friendliest guy in the world. Maybe, he admitted. But today something changed, don't you think? I didn't have time to answer because thunder suddenly roared. A moment later, rain poured down so hard that the sound of the drops echoed throughout every room. We both turned our heads to the window, catching the scent of damp earth that always accompanies a summer storm. Want to see a real storm? Alex asked suddenly. I raised an eyebrow in surprise. What? Are you serious? You're suggesting we go out in the rain? Yes. He smiled so genuinely that for a moment I wondered if this was the same Alex I thought I knew. It's something worth seeing. Come on. You're crazy, I laughed, but he was already heading toward the door. Two voices battled inside me. One told me this was foolish, getting drenched in the rain for some questionable thrill. The other whispered that maybe this was a moment not to be missed. And so, I followed him. Outside, the rain was even stronger than it looked from inside. Cold drops soaked us instantly, but the air was fresh, full of life. Alex walked to the edge of the terrace, placed his hands on the wooden railing, and looked at the horizon, where the sky glowed with flashes of lightning. See, he said, almost without turning around. This isn't just rain, it's something more. I came closer, trying to ignore the water streaming down my hair. His voice sounded strange, almost philosophical. Do you always dramatize storms like this? I joked, standing next to him. He turned to me and there was something in his eyes that made me freeze. No, he said softly. I only talk this way when I feel that something important is happening. We looked at each other and it only lasted a couple of seconds, but it felt as though time had stopped. Alex took a step closer, and I suddenly realized his face was too close, his gaze too direct. Are you avoiding again? He asked, with a hint of amusement in his voice, but also a seriousness. No, I replied without even thinking. And before I realized what was happening, he slowly, gently leaned down and touched my lips with his. It wasn't forceful or demanding. It was gentle and simple, as if he were asking rather than declaring. I froze for a moment but didn't pull away. It felt strange, unfamiliar but not wrong. When we pulled away, the rain kept pouring down as if nothing had happened, but something between us had shifted. We stood there in silence, listening to the sound of the water while I tried to process what had just happened. So, was it worth it? He asked, his usual playful smile returning. I don't know, I said, smiling slightly. We'll see. I went back inside, realizing that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be erased. After the storm, I thought I'd be able to erase that moment from my memory. It was just a whim, an accidental encounter between two people in an unusual setting. But as the days went by, thoughts of Alex wouldn't leave me alone. His gaze, that light and almost weightless kiss, all of it kept coming back to me whenever I closed my eyes. We barely crossed paths after that evening. He seemed to return to his usual world, staying in his room or going out somewhere. I acted as if I was fine with that, but every time I heard his footsteps, I felt my heart skip a beat. On Friday evening, I decided to keep myself busy cleaning the living room. It was the perfect distraction. Turn up the music, sort through the stack of books on the table, put everything back in place. But just as I got into it, Alex appeared in the doorway. Are you running away? He asked, his voice full of that familiar light sarcasm. He held a mug of tea and looked relaxed, as if he was completely certain that his presence was welcome. And are you still trying to catch me? I replied, trying to sound calm, though I was boiling inside. I'm not trying to catch you. It's just that you're hiding too obviously, he said, sitting down on the couch and sipping his tea. And I thought it was time we talked. I froze and turned to him. His tone was serious but not heavy. He looked at me like he was ready to wait as long as needed. About what? I placed a vase on the shelf and turned to him, trying to appear indifferent. About what happened, outside in the rain. That wasn't just an accident, was it? An accident, I repeated, trying to make my voice sound confident. Of course, it was just circumstances. Do you really think so? He leaned forward, placing his mug on the table. Because I don't. I felt my palms starting to sweat. Everything I'd built up in my head, explanations, excuses, logical constructs, began to crumble under his straightforward, confident gaze. Alex, it doesn't mean anything, I said, but even I didn't believe my own words. Nothing? He stood up from the couch and took a step toward me. It definitely didn't feel like nothing. And you know that? I took a step back, leaning against the bookshelf. He came closer but didn't push, leaving just enough space for me to walk away if I wanted to. Why are you so sure? I asked, looking him in the eyes. Because I saw how you looked at me then, and I see it now. You're not afraid of what happened. You're afraid of what it might mean. His words seemed to break down a wall inside me. I knew he was right, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. Alex, I began, but he gently interrupted me. Just tell me if I'm wrong. Say there's nothing and I'll leave. I wanted to say it, I really did, but instead I was silent, feeling the air between us grow heavier. Alex stepped closer, and now he was only inches away. His hand rose slightly to touch my shoulder, and I felt a warmth that felt so wrong but at the same time so right. Hayley. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. I'm not trying to complicate things, but I need to know what you feel. My heart was beating so loudly that I almost couldn't hear his words. And then, before I could think it through, I leaned forward and gently touched his lips with mine. It was quick, almost like an answer to the question he'd asked. But at that moment I realized this was not the end, it was only the beginning. When I stepped back, he smiled, his eyes warm. Thank you, he said quietly. I turned away, trying to handle the wave of emotions that hit me. But inside, everything had changed. Alex was no longer just that guy who lived next door. He had become something more, something I would have to figure out. The morning after I kissed Alex was the strangest of my life. I thought maybe I could pretend that nothing had happened, but it turned out to be impossible. Every time I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw a different version of myself. Something had changed, and I could no longer ignore it. Alex, as always, was calm. Throughout the day, he didn't do anything unusual. He drank coffee, sat with his laptop in the living room, even helped me pull an old vacuum cleaner out of the closet. But every movement, every accidental touch, every glance, it all spoke louder than words. He was waiting for me to say something. By evening, the tension became unbearable. We both ended up in the kitchen, almost as if by silent agreement, having dinner together. He was making pasta and I was peeling apples for dessert. It could have been an ordinary evening if not for the thick air between us, so heavy you could cut it with a knife. Hayley, he suddenly said, without looking up from chopping vegetables. Are we really going to keep pretending nothing happened? I dropped the knife, and it clattered loudly against the cutting board. Alex turned to me, his gaze serious but steady. He wasn't rushing or pressuring, he was just waiting. I don't know, I sighed. I don't know what to do with it. Maybe we should stop overthinking, he suggested, placing the pasta on the table. Let's sit down, eat, and just talk. I nodded, even though every part of me screamed that a conversation was the last thing I wanted. When we sat down, I felt the weight of the moment crashing over me like waves. This is wrong, Alex, I said, trying to sound firm. We're family. Well, almost. Almost, he repeated, leaning his elbows on the table. And that's what this is all about, isn't it? That's what scares you. Of course it scares me, I blurted out, surprising myself. Don't you understand that this is all impossible? And what if it's not? He asked calmly, but his words sounded like a challenge. What if we stop putting labels on it and just be honest with each other? I got up from the table and began pacing the room. Every word he said stirred up emotions I didn't know how to handle. "You're the one complicating things," I whispered, stopping by the window. The rain was tapping against the glass again, as if reminding me of that night when everything started. Alex came up beside me, leaving a small space between us. He didn't try to crowd me. He simply stood there, as if his presence alone could give me the answers I needed. "I'm not complicating anything," he said softly. "I just want to understand what you feel. No rules, no fears, just you and me." I turned to him, my hands unconsciously clenched into fists. His gaze was so open and honest that I wanted to run away, but instead, I asked, "And what if this is all a mistake?" He smiled, but there was no mockery in his smile, only warmth. "Then it will be our mistake," he said. "But I don't think it is." The words hung in the air. And at that moment I realized there was no point in running anymore. It didn't matter if it was right or wrong. We had already crossed a line we couldn't go back from. "I don't know what comes next," I said quietly. "No one does," he replied. "But that doesn't mean we can't try." He took a step closer to me, and this time I didn't step back. His hand gently touched mine, and it was enough for me to feel all my fears fading away. Not completely, not forever, but at least for this moment. "All right, Alex," I said, exhaling. "One step at a time." "One step at a time," he repeated. And at that moment, I knew the decision had already been made. This wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something we would have to figure out together.